The world always believed that if the United States ever fell, it would be because of war tanks on borders, jets in the sky, flags burning on the battlefield, but that isn't how empires collapse anymore. They collapse when the world quietly learns how to survive without them, and that's exactly what happened. The moment Russia and Mexico joined forces,
President Vladimir Putin claims that Russia would support Mexico in the face of a possible military invasion by the United States. The president of Russia has sent its full support to the Mexican government and has assured that the worst mistake the United States could make would be to cause an invasion of Mexico. Russia has offered the Mexican government send military troops to train their soldiers. Also, there is talk of establishing new military bases at the border, but Russia being in total control.
while Washington argued, while politicians fought over headlines, while Americans assumed power was permanent, Russia and Mexico rewired the global system right under America's nose. Trade routes shifted, energy markets slipped away, digital currency replaced the dollar, and for the first time in modern history, the most powerful nation on earth couldn't stop it. An empire didn't fall, it was replaced. For decades, the world was told that the United States would never lose its grip on global power. Military dominance, economic influence, and cultural reach formed an empire unlike anything in modern history. Every country, whether ally or adversary, learned to move cautiously around Washington. But empires do not collapse in explosions. They collapse in silence. When their rivals start making moves they cannot stop. And that is exactly what happened when Russia and Mexico did the unthinkable. It began with an announcement that caught even the most seasoned analysts off guard. Russia and Mexico revealed a joint economic and security pact that reshaped the Western Hemisphere. On the surface, the agreement looked like a collection of trade and infrastructure commitments, but buried beneath the fine print was something far more disruptive, a framework that weakened U.S. influence on its own border. Mexico had always been deeply intertwined with the United States. Trade, migration, security, supply chains, everything linked the two nations. Washington believed that the connection was unbreakable, but while American officials focused on crises overseas, Russia patiently built relationships south of the U.S. border, investing in energy projects, telecommunications, agriculture, and military. Technology, it wasn't charity, it was strategy. The final agreement positioned Mexico as a regional power, not a junior partner. Russia pledged financing for oil refineries, manufacturing hubs, and transport networks designed to reduce Mexico's dependency on the U.S. economy. In return, Mexico granted Russia special access to strategic ports on both the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, bypassing American-controlled shipping lanes and tariff barriers. For Russia, the pact was more than business, it was revenge for decades of U.S. sanctions. When the news broke, Washington dismissed it as symbolic. Officials claimed it would not affect American interests and that Mexico would remain economically tied to the U.S. market. But behind closed doors, panic was spreading through the corridors of power. The pillars of American dominance were beginning to crack. The first shockwave hit the energy sector. For years, the United States relied on Mexico to refine and export fuel across North America. With Russia funding new energy infrastructure, the cost of Mexican oil and gas exports to U.S. companies suddenly surged. Refineries that once operated at predictable prices now demanded premiums that disrupted the American energy market. Under ordinary circumstances, Washington might have retaliated with sanctions, but punishing Mexico risked destabilizing the border and accelerating the shift toward Russia. The second shockwave came from migration. Russia and Mexico collaborated on job creation projects in regions that once relied on seasonal labor in the United States. A declining flow of migrant workers created labor shortages in American agriculture, raising food prices across the country. The backlash was instant. Protests erupted in U.S. farming states demanding federal intervention, but the government had no legal mechanism to force Mexico to reverse course. The third shockwave struck the military sphere. Russia quietly delivered advanced cybersecurity systems and drone defense technology to Mexico. For the first time in generations, the United States could not peer across its own border without encountering foreign electronic barriers. Intelligence agencies warned of a future in which American surveillance could no longer track activity near the Gulf of Mexico, a vulnerability that Washington had never imagined possible. But the most devastating blow didn't come from energy, migration, or military channels. It came from economics. Russia and Mexico announced a new digital currency settlement system that bypassed the US dollar entirely. Latin American nations struggling under dollar volatility expressed immediate interest. Brazil, Argentina, and Chile initiated exploratory talks within weeks. If the momentum continued, the US dollar risked losing its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, the very region the United States had always treated as its uncontested sphere of influence. Markets didn't wait for confirmation. The dollar slipped, commodity prices fluctuated. Investors shifted capital into Mexican and Russian infrastructure bonds, fearing that American assets would soon face volatility. For the first time in its modern history, the United States found itself reacting, not leading. The crisis struck at a time when America was already overstretched. The Pentagon was funding military commitments across Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Internal political division paralyzed long-term policymaking. Infrastructure at home was deteriorating, and major corporations were offshoring production to Asia. The nation that once set global trends now struggled to solve its own domestic challenges. Russia and Mexico did not need to defeat the United States in battle. They only needed to offer the world an alternative. Analysts across Washington warned that pressuring Mexico could backfire dramatically. Sanctions might accelerate Mexico's shift toward Russian protection. Threats of military action were off the table. The public would never support it. Diplomatic isolation was impossible. Latin American nations were already building closer ties with the Mexico-Russia coalition. Every strategy the United States considered only highlighted its shrinking list of options. What terrified U.S. planners most was the speed of the transformation. The country that once commanded the world now watched its global influence erode from within its own neighborhood. For the first time since the Cold War, there was no clear plan, no decisive solution, no path to easy recovery. The world was moving without American permission, and as the United States hesitated, Russia and Mexico accelerated. Confident that time was now on their side. The shock of the Russia-Mexico alliance did not fade with time. It deepened. Every sector of American life began to feel the ripple effects, and the country that once projected certainty now radiated confusion. The crisis wasn't just happening overseas or on television screens. It was happening inside the United States itself, and not even the most seasoned political leaders knew how to stop it. The first signs of internal panic came from Wall Street. Financial institutions that once assumed the US dollar would forever be the world standard quietly started moving capital overseas. Investors were not driven by ideology, but by instinct. Money always runs toward stability, and stability was shifting away from Washington. Bond yields trembled. Commodity markets entered unpredictable cycles. What once felt like the safest economy on earth suddenly felt exposed. Then came the divide in Washington. The political class split between two opposing responses. One faction demanded aggressive retaliation, including sanctions and trade restrictions against Mexico. The other warned that such actions would trigger an economic disaster worse than the crisis itself. The result was paralysis, endless debates. No unified plan. Meanwhile, Russia and Mexico continued executing their strategy without hesitation. Latin America watched closely. For decades, U.S. influence in the region depended on the belief that challenging Washington would bring punishment, instability, or international isolation, but the geopolitical landscape had changed. Mexico, once seen as dependent on the United States for survival, was now demonstrating that economic independence was possible not alone, but with Russia as a strategic partner. Within months, the Mexico-Russia pact evolved into something much larger. Brazil announced a new energy agreement with Mexico that placed Russian companies at the center of joint exploration efforts. Argentina sought assistance for nuclear power projects. Colombia negotiated access to the new digital settlement currency to stabilize inflation across the region. Political leaders who once feared antagonizing Washington now spoke confidently about a post-U.S. world. The Western Hemisphere, the one region the United States had always assumed it controlled, was slipping away. Inside the United States, the consequences became unavoidable. When the cost of imported oil spiked, transportation companies raised shipping prices. When shipping prices rose, retail prices followed. The cost of food, fuel, and basic goods climbed faster than wages. American families who had already struggled during previous economic downturns now faced something even more severe, a cost of living crisis driven not by domestic mismanagement, but by the crumbling of global power. Factories across the Midwest that relied on components imported from Mexico faced unprecedented delays. Russia had prioritized shipments to Latin American nations participating in the digital currency settlement system, leaving U.S. contracts at the bottom of the list. Manufacturing slowed. Layoffs began. Protests erupted outside state capitals demanding immediate action, but the federal government had no quick solution. Cable networks filled with shouting, commentators blamed foreign enemies, political opponents, corporations, immigrants, anyone but the structural reality that the power balance of the world was changing. Citizens didn't want geopolitical nuance, they wanted relief. Then the crisis hit the agricultural sector again, but harder than before. Mexico and Russia launched a joint initiative to deploy Russian satellite-guided irrigation and climate monitoring systems across Mexican farmland. The result was explosive productivity. Suddenly, Mexico was able to export food to Latin America and Asia at extremely competitive prices. Farmers in the United States already struggling, with labor shortages now faced overwhelming competition. In response, the federal government approved emergency subsidies, but the budget deficit ballooned. Economists warned of a debt spiral. International markets were already losing confidence in U.S. financial leadership. The more Washington tried to stabilize the economy through spending, the more investors looked for alternatives abroad. The United States attempted diplomatic damage control. Officials traveled to Ottawa and London, seeking to reinforce old alliances outside North America. Both governments expressed support publicly. Privately, they signaled hesitation. Trade with Mexico held enormous benefits. Access to Russian-funded Latin American infrastructure promised growth that European and Commonwealth markets could not match. Even historic allies were calculating their next moves with long-term survival in mind, not loyalty. The Pentagon issued its own warning. For the first time in modern history, a rival power had established a strategic footprint in the Western Hemisphere. Russia did not need to deploy troops or missiles. Economic control had become the new front line. If Mexico continued to upgrade its ports, naval infrastructure, and cybersecurity systems with Russian assistance, the United States would be forced to confront a permanent security disadvantage just beyond its southern border. Military leaders urged the government to invest in counter-infrastructure projects, but Congress remained gridlocked. One side refused to allocate the necessary spending. The other insisted that infrastructure was meaningless without restoring economic leverage first. While the political system debated, Russia and Mexico continued. Building. The real turning point came when Russia completed the first stage of a space-based telecommunications network that linked directly with Mexico. The system promised cheap satellite internet and data transmission across Latin America, entirely independent of U.S.-controlled companies. With that single act, Russia dealt a blow that no missile could match. Digital sovereignty had shifted. Nations that depended on American servers and networks for decades now had an alternative. The media labeled the situation a crisis. Analysts called it an economic war. Citizens called it betrayal. But global power doesn't disappear because people disapprove of its decline. It disappears because someone else takes its place. Across Latin America, nations celebrated a new era of cooperation. New trade corridors emerged, infrastructure projects multiplied, digital currency exchanges expanded, and at each milestone, Russia and Mexico stood at the center, shaping a future that no longer required U.S. permission. In Washington, officials attempted to reassure the public that the United States remained the world's strongest power, but confidence is not built on speeches. It is built on influence, and influence was draining away like water through fractured stone. For the first time in generations, American power was not feared, it was questioned. And somewhere deep inside the corridors of intelligence agencies, a quiet realization took shape: the collapse of a global empire doesn't happen when it is defeated. It happens when the world learns how to live without it. Russia and Mexico had not destroyed the United States. They had simply created a world in which America was no longer indispensable. The decline had begun.